Shadow of the Scarecrow, The First Omen. I'm Adam Baker, a simple farmer who once believed the land could never betray me. We'd lived on these acres for generations, and my parents' voices still echoed in the old barn where I first learned how to hold a pitchfork. Back then, I believed the fields were my allies. Never did I imagine that the very scarecrow meant to protect our harvest would become our greatest nightmare. It started with a chill in the air on a late autumn night. Even though our region was known for temperate evenings, an unnatural cold seeped through the window frames of my farmhouse. I woke to a strange noise, a rhythmic rustling, like footsteps trudging through dried cornstalks. I peered outside, scanning the fields. In the soft moonlight, I noticed something off about the old scarecrow I'd set up at the edge of the corn. It looked different, although I couldn't put my finger on why. Maybe the angle of its arms had shifted? It was past midnight, and fatigue clouded my eyes, so I brushed it off. Come morning, Sarah, my wife, and our two daughters, Lily and Rebecca, joined me for breakfast. I mentioned the odd sensation from the night before. Sarah said she, too, had heard rustling outside her window. We all dismissed it as a stray animal or wind stirring the corn husks. But then I stepped outside. The scarecrow stood there with arms raised higher than I remembered, almost as if in a silent, agonized scream. My heart thumped. Was it just a trick of the eyes? Little did I know this was only the beginning of a terror that would grip my entire family. The dreadful familiarity. That day, the sun hung high, warming the fields, and it felt almost normal. I kept myself busy with chores, repairing the fence, checking on the livestock, and tidying the barn. The memory of the scarecrow's raised arms kept nagging me. But with so much to do, I tried to stay practical. After all, wood beams and old clothes can shift in a storm. Or so I told myself. Come evening, Sarah handed me a steaming cup of coffee on the porch. Our daughters had gone inside to watch their favorite show. The sky dimmed to a smoky purple, and the silhouette of that ragged figure in the field drew my gaze like a magnet. Something pulled at the edge of my mind, a sense of recognition. Like the scarecrow's posture reminded me of someone I'd once seen in pain or distress. Night fell, and the temperature dropped quickly, more than usual for early fall. I swore I heard faint movements again, leaves crunching, footsteps, almost measured, as though pacing. Sarah, near the window, jumped at each new sound. Adam, maybe we should bring the kids into our room tonight, she whispered. Despite wanting to reassure her, I couldn't ignore the knot in my stomach. Without a word, I left the porch and ventured into the field. I wanted to prove to myself that nothing was amiss. But as I approached the scarecrow, a gust of wind rattled the cornstalks. I flicked on my flashlight and nearly dropped it. The scarecrow's head, made from a stitched burlap sack, seemed turned in my direction. My heart lurched. I told myself it was just the breeze. Yet, when I looked up a second time, its gaze had shifted again, as if it watched every breath I took. Disturbed dreams. That night I slept fitfully. My dreams were punctuated by twisted images of burlap and straw. I dreamt of faceless beings in the corn, silently reaching out for me. Then I jolted awake to a sound beneath our bedroom window, slow, plodding footsteps. My heart pounded as I craned my ear. The noise stopped. All that remained was an unsettling hush. Sarah stirred. Adam, did you hear that? She asked, her voice barely audible over the sudden thrumming in my ears. A wave of dread washed over me. In the next room, the girls slept, blissfully unaware of the fear that now gripped their parents. I forced myself to the window. When I peered out, all I saw was darkness. Still, the sense of being watched weighed on me, pressing me down with an invisible force. After minutes that felt like hours, I crept back into bed, but found no comfort in the sheets. Every tiny noise, the creak of the floorboards, the distant whistle of the wind, seemed amplified 1,000-fold. When dawn finally broke, I forced myself to check the scarecrow again. My legs shook with every step across the frosty grass. I found it a few feet closer to the house, though I couldn't prove it to anyone else. Its wooden post had dragged through the dirt, leaving a faint trail behind. And once more, those arms were raised. This time, they pointed almost accusingly at the farmhouse. My stomach churned with fear and disbelief. Something about the scarecrow's posture suggested a silent scream, as if it begged to be freed from some unspeakable torment. Searching for rationality. I'm a man of the earth. I believe in tangible explanations. Rotting fence posts, weak nails, rummaging critters. So, I spent most of the morning circling the scarecrow, testing the soil, looking for signs that might explain its migration. But no footprints, human or animal, could be seen except my own. The post itself was still intact, though splinters around the base suggested violent twisting, almost as if something had wrenched it loose from the ground. I tried to share my concerns with Sarah, but she was already on edge. She had awakened to find the kitchen light flickering erratically, as if an electrical surge pulsed through the house. Our daughters, too, grew weary. They complained of hearing scratches beneath their windows. I told them it was probably squirrels or raccoons, though I didn't believe my own words. By afternoon, I thought about removing the scarecrow. I even brought a hammer, nails, and some rope, determined to stake it down in one place or toss it out entirely. But when I got close, an unnatural feeling of dread overwhelmed me. My throat went dry. It felt like standing in a silent clearing where no bird dared to sing. Something in my gut whispered, "Don't touch it." An irrational terror seized me, and my hands started trembling so violently, I nearly dropped the tools. I retreated, hoping to find the resolve another day. Or maybe I was hoping that the problem would solve itself. Deep down, I knew we were dancing on the edge of something far more sinister than a loose post in the soil. A visitor's concern. My neighbor, Ben Hawthorne, stopped by to check on us that afternoon. He was a kindly man, all rough edges and warm smiles. He'd heard from someone in town that the Bakers were having a bit of an unsettling time on the farm. I tried to brush it off, but he pressed gently. "Adam, you know me. If something's going on, you can trust me." I hesitated, then led him around to see the scarecrow. He squinted in the midday sun, looking it up and down. "Does seem a tad more battered than when I last saw it," he admitted. I told him about the strange footsteps, the changing positions. He didn't laugh, but worry shadowed his gaze. "Could be some local kids messing around," he offered, though he didn't sound convinced. Or maybe he trailed off, swallowing. "I've heard old folk tales about cursed totems and watchers, scarecrows that act as vessels. But that's just old wives' talk." We both fell silent. I could see in Ben's eyes that he wanted to help. He offered to stay overnight, to see if he could catch the culprit in the act. Desperate for peace of mind, I accepted. We planned to stay awake in the living room, watching the windows that faced the field. That evening, as we gathered flashlights and blankets, something about Ben's expression struck me as odd. His good-natured smile seemed overshadowed by a growing unease, as if he sensed a lurking darkness that neither of us dared name. Night watch. Ben and I sat in the living room with only a single lamp illuminating our surroundings. Sarah and the girls were tucked upstairs, hoping for a peaceful sleep. Every so often, one of us would glance out the window, our eyes adjusting to the moonlit shapes in the field. The scarecrow was barely visible, just a dark form against the darker night. Midnight approached, and exhaustion tugged at our eyelids. We struggled to stay alert. We took turns with the flashlight scanning the perimeter. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling through the cornstalks like a restless spirit. At one point, Ben swore he heard labored breathing near the house. We rushed to the window, but there was nothing. Just the emptiness of the farmland and the faint outline of that damned figure. At about 2 in the morning, I heard a soft thud from the porch. Heart hammering, I motioned for Ben to stay put as I crept to the front door. Carefully, I opened it. Darkness, stillness. But then a whisper of movement drew my eyes downward. Fresh muddy tracks, shaped like small footprints, led away from the door and back into the yard. My blood ran cold. It was as if a child had been walking barefoot on the porch. I shone my flashlight into the distance. The scarecrow stood taller now, arms lifted toward the sky, like it was beckoning some unseen force. I shook Ben awake from his doze. We stared at each other, both utterly at a loss. A horrifying discovery. Morning light offered little comfort. The footprints remained on the porch, partially dried. They looked like they belonged to someone very small, perhaps a child of 5 or 6 years old. Yet we had no children of that age here. Lily and Rebecca were both older, and they hadn't left their room all night. The realization that a child's footprints showed up in the dead of night sent a shiver down my spine. While Ben tried to distract the girls, Sarah and I followed the footprints out to the dirt path. They disappeared near the scarecrow. I stood there, mouth dry, as I noticed a new detail. The scarecrow's burlap head had fresh hairs in the fabric, resembling eye holes, and it almost looked damp, as if something had wept from within. I couldn't dismiss the idea of a supernatural presence any longer. Rational explanations were slipping through my fingers like sand. I considered burning the scarecrow right then and there, but fear and superstition held me back. 1,000 old stories about uninvited spirits and retribution from beyond the grave flickered through my mind. Ben left that afternoon, unsettled but convinced we needed more help, perhaps from the local sheriff or from someone who understood these old legends. Before he climbed into his truck, Ben gripped my shoulder and said, "Adam, whatever happens, don't face this alone." His voice trembled with sincerity. I nodded, fighting an onslaught of dread. Unseen hands. That night, I found myself alone on the porch, cradling a cup of coffee gone cold. Sarah had taken the girls to bed, hoping to shield them from the strain that was devouring my sanity. I stared at the scarecrow, now a dark silhouette against a sky full of stars that felt too bright, too watchful. Suddenly, the porch swing beside me creaked, though no one was there. A chilling breeze swept across my face, carrying the scent of damp earth. Then, a barely perceptible scraping sound moved along the wooden boards, like something dragging or crawling. I stood, adrenaline surging, and flicked on the porch light. Everything fell silent, but I sensed a presence, unseen, intangible. I found muddy residue on the swing seat, as though someone had sat there with muddy clothes. My eyes darted across the yard, searching for movement. That was when I noticed the scarecrow's posture had changed again. Its arms no longer reached upward. They stretched outward, parallel to the ground, as if in a mock crucifixion. A faint moan of wind rustled the cornstalks, and I realized the figure's head was cocked at a slight angle, looking straight at me. With my heart pounding, I stepped inside and bolted the door. If there was something out there, I had no desire to welcome it in. Still, the haunting thought remained. It's already too close. Maybe it's already here. Unanswered questions. After another sleepless night, I decided to leave no stone unturned. I drove into town, seeking the local library. Our small community didn't have much in the way of archives, but sometimes old newspapers or folk records hold the answers that modern minds fail to see. Miss Caldwell, the elderly librarian, greeted me with a surprised smile. "Adam Baker, what brings you to my dusty shelves?" She seemed intrigued when I asked about local legends, particularly anything involving scarecrows or curses. With a knowing glint in her eye, she led me to a corner filled with musty volumes and worn-out folklore pamphlets. "Few people ask about these anymore," she said quietly. "But I do recall a story from decades ago, something about a traveling exorcist who visited a farm on the outskirts of town. They said the farm's scarecrow was possessed by a wandering spirit." She paused, then added, "That farmer ended up leaving in the dead of night. Some say the scarecrow wouldn't let them harvest in peace." My fingertips tingled as I skimmed the pages, piecing together half-formed legends of cursed farmland and restless spirits. One particular note caught my eye. A scarecrow fashioned from the clothes of a missing child can serve as a beacon for something that's neither living nor dead. A cold sweat beaded on my forehead. Had I unknowingly used clothes with a tragic history? I recalled rummaging through old trunks in the barn for rags. Could the source of the scarecrow's apparel be cursed? I had no proof, but the possibility lodged like a thorn in my mind. Sarah's ultimatum. When I returned, Sarah was waiting for me with a grim expression. "The girls are petrified, Adam," she said in a trembling voice. They won't even look out their windows anymore. I told her about what I'd learned, about the old stories and the cursed garments. She listened, eyes wide, her hands twisting nervously in her apron. Finally, she took a shaky breath. "Then let's get rid of it," she insisted. "Let's burn the scarecrow. Bury it, or do whatever we must." As if on cue, a dull thud sounded from above. We raced upstairs to find Lily and Rebecca standing in their room, staring at the window. On the outside glass, a single muddy handprint pressed against the pane. It was small, frighteningly small. That was all the push Sarah needed. She demanded we do something at once or leave the farm altogether. Truth be told, leaving our ancestral home felt like giving up on generations of hard work. But the thought of my children in harm's way cracked my resolve. We agreed on a plan. At daybreak, I would destroy the scarecrow. Sarah would take the girls to her sister's place in town. As I packed a small bag for them, a suffocating sense of dread enveloped me. Though I'd never been one for superstition, it felt as if I were about to defy a centuries-old taboo. Dawn's reckoning. At first light, Sarah drove the girls away, leaving me to face the farm alone. I stood at the edge of the cornfield, spade and axe in hand, feeling both foolish and terrified. The morning sun made everything look ordinary, just rows of corn and a ragged figure stuffed with straw. I tried to cling to that sense of normalcy. I approached the scarecrow, each step accompanied by a pulse of fear, closer and closer, until I could see the dusty burlap threads. Its eyes, those dark, torn holes, stared back at me. The closer I got, the more I felt a horrible pressure, as if something heavy coiled in the air around me. My grip on the axe tightened. I swung at the post with all my might. Wood splintered, and the scarecrow lurched. A gust of wind kicked up, swirling leaves into a chaotic dance. I hacked again and again, adrenaline fueling every blow. Finally, the post snapped and the figure collapsed onto the ground. Relief briefly washed over me. Then I set it ablaze. Flames engulfed the straw, curling around the old clothes and burlap head. For a moment, I allowed myself to hope. But as the fire consumed it, I thought I heard a faint, keening cry, a wail too soft to be wind. My arms quivered. Convinced it was done, I left the smoldering remains in the field. My stomach twisted with guilt and apprehension. I tried to convince myself that the nightmare would end now, that our farm would return to normal. The ashen aftermath. After the flames died, I buried what remained. A pile of charred straw, wood fragments, and singed cloth. The odor of burnt burlap clung to the air, and I half expected the ground to reject it. Then I patted the soil flat and ventured back to the farmhouse, exhausted but resolute. I spent the rest of the day cleaning, as if scrubbing away every reminder of our recent terror. By evening, the house felt emptier without Sarah and the girls, but calmer. Even the livestock seemed more at ease. I allowed myself a rare moment of peace, thinking perhaps we'd banished whatever dark presence had plagued us. That night, the wind rattled the windows, but I refused to let fear take over. I forced myself to sleep in my bed, lights off, curtains drawn. Sometime around midnight, I awoke with a jolt. The temperature in the room had dropped so drastically that I could see my breath. My heart thudded as I listened. At first, there was only silence. Then, a scraping sound from outside. A slow, deliberate sound, like something heavy being dragged across the ground. Racing to the window, I peered out. My eyes struggled against the darkness. Beneath the moonlight, I spotted the unmistakable outline of a figure standing exactly where I had buried the scarecrow. My mind reeled. It was the same shape, the same ragged posture, but now it looked more contorted, as though its limbs had been scorched and twisted. My blood turned to ice. The return. Cold sweat matted my hair to my forehead as I stumbled outside. I barely managed to throw on a coat before trudging toward the figure. Every step felt heavier, as if unseen hands tried to hold me back. The spot where I'd buried the scarecrow now lay ripped open. Fresh, loose dirt scattered around a gaping hole. The figure remained motionless, yet its presence radiated malice. I shone my flashlight over it, revealing scorched burlap clinging to blackened straw. The arms were twisted upward in that awful, silent scream. A vile stench of burnt fabric and decayed earth assaulted my senses. Rage flared in me. "Leave us alone!" I shouted into the night. My voice sounded small even to my own ears. The figure didn't move. But somewhere in the cornstalks, I heard that rustling, those footsteps, like a chorus of small, pattering steps. Then came a child's laugh. Soft, echoing, and impossibly close. I staggered backward. The scarecrow's dark eye sockets seemed to track me, penetrating into my very soul. I realized that destroying it with fire was not enough, perhaps impossible. This was something ancient and beyond my understanding, drawn here by history, by hidden tragedies in these fields. Fear and despair waged war within me as I raced back to the house. The silent screams of the scarecrow chased me in my mind, haunting every footstep I took, a desperate plea. Through the night, I sat trembling in the kitchen with the lights blazing, phone in hand. My first call was to Sarah, telling her to stay put in town no matter what. She begged me to join them, but I felt compelled to face this horror, if not for my sake, then for theirs. I couldn't let whatever this was haunt us forever. My second call was to Ben. He answered groggily, but I poured out the story of how the scarecrow had returned. Words tumbled over each other, soaked in terror. He promised to come at dawn, and I felt a small flicker of relief at the thought of not facing this alone. Yet, dawn brought no comfort. The entire house felt saturated with a presence, like static electricity crackling in the air. I had the unnerving sense that the walls themselves were watching me. Every board in the floor creaked ominously under my foot. When I peeked outside, I caught a glimpse of the scarecrow looming even closer, propped against a rusted plow that stood maybe 20 feet from the porch. Its arms, those disfigured, outstretched limbs, seemed to beckon me with cruel invitation. My resolve faltered. This was no ordinary haunting. I considered calling a priest or some kind of spiritual expert, but time was running short, and desperation gnawed at my common sense. I knew I needed to act, or else risk losing my mind completely. Ben's arrival. Ben arrived at sunrise, armed with a rifle and grim determination. His face was drawn, pale. He took one look at me and frowned. "You look like hell," he said. "Let's finish this." We walked out to the plow. The scarecrow was still there, though it looked even more mutilated in the early morning light. The stench of burnt burlap and something sickly sweet lingered in the air. Ben gagged at the sight. "What in God's name?" I explained everything, from the childlike footprints to the cackling laughter. He listened, jaw set, eyes darting nervously between me and the motionless figure. Without a word, he pumped the rifle and pointed it at the scarecrow. My heart hammered in my chest. In the stark morning silence, the gunshots sounded deafening. Each bullet tore into the straw, splintering bits of burlap and scattering them to the wind. But the scarecrow remained upright, pinned to the plow as though by some invisible force. With shaky hands, Ben reloaded and fired again. This time, the post behind it cracked, and the figure toppled to the ground in a heap of charred rags. Dust and shredded straw rose in a cloud around us. We stood there, both breathing heavily, uncertain if we'd just done something helpful or unleashed a deeper evil. The farmland fell silent, an almost suffocating quiet. I swallowed hard, refusing to believe this was truly over. Revelation in the barn. Still rattled from the confrontation, Ben and I decided to check the barn for any clues. Sometimes, old buildings hold secrets in their rafters and forgotten corners. The barn was dimly lit by thin beams of morning sun piercing the worn wooden slats. Dust motes danced in the rays, giving the place an eerie stillness. We rummaged through old crates, searching for anything that might explain the scarecrow's origins. Eventually, we found a broken trunk concealed behind bales of hay. Inside, we discovered a child's tattered dress, frayed at the hem, a piece of clothing that looked startlingly similar to the ragged outfit our scarecrow had worn. My heart sank. There was also a small, leather-bound journal with ink so faded it was barely legible. It belonged to my grandfather, dated decades before I was born. Skimming through the pages, we learned of a tragedy. A neighbor's child had gone missing, presumed dead. In an attempt to keep the memory alive, or perhaps to appease some local superstition, my grandfather had fashioned a scarecrow using the child's garments. A final entry read, "I can't bear to see it in the fields anymore. There is a presence in those old clothes." Realization swept over me like an icy wave. The child's spirit might still be bound to the scarecrow, a restless entity. Ben swore under his breath. Whatever we were up against was more than just a ghost story. It was a family secret festering for generations. Confronting the past. A storm began brewing outside, dark clouds rolling in faster than I'd ever seen. Thunder rumbled in the distance as Ben and I left the barn, clutching the journal like a cursed artifact. The scarecrow lay in tatters near the plow, but neither of us could shake the feeling that it was somehow still alive, its malevolent spirit drifting unseen through the farm. Lightning forked across the sky, illuminating the farmhouse in blinding flashes. The storm wind howled, bending the cornstalks into agonized shapes. Ben and I hurried inside, the old house groaning under the wind's assault. An oppressive weight pressed down on us the moment we shut the door. Against my better judgment, I reread the journal's final pages, hoping for a clue. My grandfather had written, "If it finds no rest, give it a name. Return to the place where it was last at peace and pray for mercy." The words were vague, but they hinted at some form of ritual. The child's name, Evelyn Marsh, was scrawled on a separate note tucked into the back of the journal. My grandfather's handwriting trembled on the page, as though he feared even the memory of that name. Rain battered the windows, and thunder shook the roof. We had no time to second-guess. If we were going to free this restless soul, we needed to do it now, while we still had the courage. The ritual at the old well. My grandfather's notes mentioned an old well behind the orchard, a place where the missing child had loved to play. If there was any spot where Evelyn Marsh had felt peace, that might be it. So, braving the lashing rain, Ben and I trudged through the mud, guided by the sporadic flashes of lightning. The orchard trees swayed wildly, their branches clawing at the stormy sky. Our boots sank into the soaked ground, and the wind nearly knocked us off balance. At last, we found the well, an ancient, crumbling structure surrounded by overgrown weeds. Lightning flickered again, revealing a small shape standing by the well's edge. My heart nearly stopped when I realized it was the scarecrow, or some twisted semblance of it, half destroyed by bullets and fire. It leaned forward, arms outstretched, as if guarding the entrance to the well. I gathered my nerve, holding the journal tight. I approached, calling out in a trembling voice, "Evelyn Marsh, if you are here, we want to help you find rest." My words felt small against the roaring wind. Then, in a surge of bravery, I stepped closer, the barn lantern casting flickering light across the scarecrow's tattered face. It didn't move, but I could feel a presence swirling around us. The wind momentarily died, replaced by an electric hush. I began speaking the final lines of my grandfather's plea, asking for forgiveness, naming Evelyn Marsh, and beseeching her spirit to find the peace it had been denied. The final confrontation. The scarecrow twitched. Its scorched burlap head jerked toward me, and for an instant, I saw not straw and cloth but the sorrowful face of a child. A piercing gust of wind collided with us, nearly tearing the journal from my hands. Ben brandished the lantern, holding it high. "Don't let up," he shouted over the gale. I continued reciting the lines from my grandfather's notes, my voice cracking from both fear and the strain of shouting into the storm. Then came a sound that froze me in place. A chorus of children's laughter, layered with keening wails of anguish. The orchard erupted in a violent flurry, branches scratching at each other like tortured spirits. Under the lantern's glow, the scarecrow's arms shifted from an outstretched scream to a slow, deliberate motion, as though it was being drawn upward by invisible strings. I forced out the last words of the plea. "We name you Evelyn Marsh. Find your peace." The wind roared, thunder boomed, and the scarecrow's body went rigid. For a split second, everything stood frozen. Then, A bolt of lightning struck alarmingly close, illuminating the scene in harsh, white brilliance. In that flash, I saw the scarecrow disintegrate into a flurry of ashes and scorched fabric. The echo of a child's sob drifted through the orchard, mingling with the storm. A sudden calm descended, the wind dying away as the final pieces of the scarecrow blew into the darkness. A haunting peace. The storm receded as quickly as it had arrived. Rain still pattered softly on the orchard leaves, but the violent wind and thunder were gone. The air felt cleansed, as though some long-standing tension had finally snapped. Ben and I stood there, soaked to the bone, hearts pounding. In the lantern's diminishing light, we surveyed the area. The scarecrow was nowhere to be seen, only bits of charred fabric drifting in the puddles. An indescribable weight lifted from my chest. Evelyn Marsh. The name still echoed in my mind, leaving behind a profound sense of sorrow. We made our way back to the farmhouse. I could almost hear the walls exhale a sigh of relief. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by a quiet that felt strangely comforting. Collapsing on the couch, I let fatigue wash over me in waves. Ben sat across from me, just as drained. By morning, the sun rose warm and bright, painting the sky in gentle pastels. I phoned Sarah, urging her to come home. Though the memory of those horrible nights would forever mark this place, the malicious energy seemed to have vanished. When my family returned, the children ran freely through the yard, unafraid. Even the farm animals seemed livelier, as though nature itself was celebrating a newly restored balance. Yet, on certain moonlit nights, I still wake up to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant whisper of a child's laughter carried by the wind. It's a reminder that some shadows never fully disappear. They linger in the corners of our world, silent observers of our courage and our fears.